short video about different types of blocks when you're using block printing. This first slide is just an array of blocks from Jaipur in India, where they do incredible artisanal block printing. And this kind of detail is not something that you would be able to achieve unless you practiced for many, many, many hours. So this slide is basically showing us a range of patterned and individual motif blocks. So I'm going to move on to the next slide, which also shows them but grouped a little bit differently. So in the upper left-hand corner, we have individual motifs that could be printed as patterns or printed in many different varieties without worrying about patterns. The lower left are interlocking blocks. So we have the individual motifs, and then we have interlocking blocks. And the interlocking blocks are set up so that you can create interlocking repeating patterns or borders. And then this last set are these continuous blocks. And as you can see with the continuous blocks, they go right up to the edge, and they will repeat if you print them that way, but they're basically blocks of square patterns, square or rectangle patterns. So I'm going to bring in the next slide here, which is some individual blocks. On the left, we have a grouping of blocks that you can imagine that this set could be used in many combinations to print, and the middle one is one motif that can be used in many combinations to print, and the far right one is a block that has a pattern incorporated within it. So the pattern is actually there in the block and interlocks. The reason I'm showing you these is because this is closer to the type of quality you might be able to achieve. The lines are thicker, the shapes are bolder, and it's less challenging to cut. I mean, it will be challenging if you try to get the kind of fine detail in some of the flowers, but it's at least simpler than the first couple of slides that I showed. So I am also going to just highlight, I did this in Photoshop, the shapes that you would be able to create in drawing or with marker that you could then trace to transfer onto a block. So once you have your shape traced and transferred onto the block and then cut, you can stay in Photoshop, scan everything back in, and work out some ideas for patterns. So I'm going to do that now by just selecting each one of these layers separately and showing you a little bit about what they can do on their own. So we'll start with the individual motif. So this individual motif obviously could be printed in a very regimented way, or because it is an individual motif, it could be printed in a way that could be turned, tossed around, lined up in different ways. It cannot be resized because it's one block, and it cannot be mirrored, but it can rotate into different directions. So if you wanted to sort of do a fake pattern, you could do something like that. I'll get rid of my extra ones there and move on to the next one. So the next one could be something like this, where this might be a block, or it might be 4 different blocks. So if it was a block, again, all you can do is rotate. You can't mirror anything, and you can't resize anything, but you can rotate things around, and that might be enough for something like this to create a pattern, although you're limited to not being able to move these groupings around. I'll show you what that might look like if you were block printing it. Spacing it that way. If you wanted to do 4 small blocks, then you would separate these individually. separate these individually, and then you would have endless possibilities of what you could do with these individual blocks. And this is something that you could do with that one sheet of linoleum block and quite easily cut it up into a lot of little smaller blocks. And obviously I'm just doing a little tossed pattern here, but you could do lined up patterns or borders or anything like that. So clearly have too big of a thing here, so fast and messy, but you get the idea. So that would be how you would approach all of these things. So the idea would be drawing simple shapes that have endless possibilities. The last one that we're going to do is this far right one, which has a grouping of pattern in it. And the idea would be to create a motif and lay it out in Photoshop or trace it by hand if you want to, then put that onto the block. And then with this, you're really saying that you just want to do one type of pattern. But the advantage of doing it this way is that if you want this pattern, you don't have to print every single motif. You would print groups of motifs. And so this is what the interlocking block would do. And then, of course, you could also add in another type of block. You know, this is obviously black on black, so it's harder to see. But let's say you printed this with hot pink and the other one with black, and you can see it differently. So you can have a pattern running in the background and then a single motif running on top. So hopefully that makes a lot of sense, and I'm going to end